So I'm going to read a little bit from Memorial, but if folks have questions, I always want to make sure that there's enough time for Q&A to get as many questions as possible, because the overwhelming majority of the time, that is where like the most interesting stuff happens. Like what y'all have to say is almost certainly more interesting than what I have to say. So we'll read a little bit of Memorial. You really won't need that much context going into it, because I'll start from the beginning and then I will be jumping around. Yeah. Mike's taking off for Osaka, but his mother's flying into Houston. Just for a few weeks, he says. Or maybe a couple of months, he says. But I need to go. The first thing I think is, fuck. The second's that we don't have the money for this. Then it occurs to me that we don't have any savings at all. But Mike's always been good about finances, always cool about separating his checks. It's something I'd always taken for granted about him. Now, he's saying that he wants to find his father. The man's gotten sick. Mike wants to catch him before he goes, and I'm on the sofa, half listening, half charging my phone. You haven't seen your mother in years, I say. She's coming here for you. I've never met her. I say, you don't even fucking like your dad. True, says Mike, but I already bought the ticket. And Ma will be here when I'm back. You're great company. She'll live. Mike's cracking eggs by the stove, flipping yolks into a pair of pans. After they've settled, he salts them, drizzling mayonnaise with a few sprigs of oregano. And Mike used to have this thing about sriracha. He'd pull a hernia whenever I reached for it, but now he squeezes a faded bottle over my omelet, rubbing it in with the spatula. I don't ask where he'll stay in Osaka. I don't ask who he'll stay with. I don't ask where his mother will sleep here, in our one-bedroom apartment, or exactly what that arrangement will look like. The thing about a moving train is that sometimes you can catch it. Some of the kids I work with, that's how their families make it into this country. If you fall, you're dead. If you're too slow, you're dead. But if you get a running start, it's never entirely gone. So I don't flip the coffee table or one of our chairs. I don't key Mike's car, ram it straight to the living room, and after the black eye, we stopped putting our hands on each other. We both figured, silently, that this was the least we could do. Today, what I do is smile. I thank Mike for letting me know. I ask Mike when he's leaving, and I know that's my mistake. I'm already reaching to toss my charger before he says it. Tomorrow. We've been fine, thank you for asking. Our relationship is, 4 years old? But that depends on how you count. We haven't been to a party in months, and when we did go to parties at first, no one knew we were fucking. Mike just stood to the side while whatever person talked her way into my space, and then he'd reach over my shoulder or slip a finger into my beer. Or he'd sneeze, stretch, and wipe his nose with my shirt sleeve. Or he'd fall into my wallet, slowly, patting it back into place. We knew how we looked or how we didn't look. But one night, a few weeks back, at a bar crawl from Mike's job, all it took was just one glance at us. Mike works at this coffee shop. It's a fusion thing where they butcher rice bowls and egg rolls, although really it's Mexican food because unless your name is Mike, that's who's cooking. They've been open for a year. This was their anniversary celebration. Mike volunteered us to help for an hour, flipping tortillas on a burner by the DJ. I felt miserable. Mike felt miserable. Everyone who passed us wore this look that said, they're miserable. They touched our shoulders, asked how long we'd been together, wondered where we'd met, how we'd managed during Harvey, and the music was too fucking loud, so Mike and I just sort of shrugged. Now, I don't say shit on our way to the airport to pick up his mother. And I don't say shit when Mike parks his car. The airport sits outside of Houston's beltways, but there's always steady traffic lining the highway. When Mike pulls up to arrivals, he takes out the keys, and a line shimmers behind us, this tiny constellation of travelers. Mike's got this mustache now, and it wavers over his face. Usually he clips all that shit off, and now I think he looks like a caricature of himself. We sit beside the terminal, and we can't have the most fucked up situation here, but still, you have to wonder. So I wonder, and I wonder if he wonders. We haven't been good at apologizing lately, and now would be a nice time. The airport sees about 111,500 visitors a day, and here we are, two of its most ridiculous. Hey, says Mike. He sighs, hands me the keys, says he'll be right back with his mother. If you leave us stranded in the parking lot, says Mike, we'll probably find you. 3 different cops speak in the car while Mike's in baggage claim. I smile at the first 2 and I frown at the third. The last guy taps the window like, what the fuck are you waiting for? And when I point toward the airport's entrance, all he does is frown. Then, I spot them on their way out. The first thing I think is that they look like family. Mike's mother is hunched, just a little bit, and he's rolling her suitcase behind her. For a while, they saw each other every year. She'd just fly down to visit, but the past few years have been rocky. The visit stopped once I moved in with Mike. The least I can do is pop the trunk. I'd like to be the guy who doesn't do that, but I'm not. Mike helps his mother adjust the back seat as she gets in, and she doesn't even look at me. Her hair's in a bun. She's got this bright blue windbreaker with a sickness mask and the faintest trace of makeup. Ma, says Mike. You hungry? She mumbles something in Japanese. She shrugs. Ma, says Mike. Mike glances at me, and he asks his mother again, and then he switches over to Japanese too. She says something, and then Mike says something, and another guy directing traffic walks up to my window. He's Latino, husky in his vest, shaved head like he's in the army, and he mounts at us through the glass, and I let down the window and ask if anything is wrong. I tell the guy that we're moving. Then move, says this man. The next words leave my mouth before I can taste them. It's a little like gravity. I say, okay, motherfucker, we're gone. And the Latino guy just frowns at me. Before he says anything else, there's a bout of honking behind us, and he laughs at me again. And then he wanders away, scratching at his chest, wincing at our car. When I roll up the window, Mike's staring directly at me. And his mother is, too. She says something, shaking her head, and I pull the car into traffic. I turn on the radio, and it's Jay-Z. I flip the channel, and it's the Migos. I turn the damn thing off, and eventually we're on the highway. All of a sudden, we're just one more soap opera among way too many. But that's when Mike's mother laughs, shaking her head. She says something in Japanese. Mike thumps the glove compartment, and he says, Ma. It's still dark when I'm up, a morning weeks later, but Mike's mother, Mitsuko, is mincing shrimp. She's hunched over the cutting board beside eggs, flour, and honey. Do you eat? She says. I tell her I do. We don't say shit while she's working. Her son left a few days ago. Mitsuko blitzes everything in a food processor, drops the mixture in a skillet, dabbing everything with soy sauce, folding the batter gradually. I take my pills and I just watch her do all this, and she ignores me the entire time, working at her own pace. When I sit on the sofa, Mitsuko stops rolling. So I stand to set the table and she starts rolling again. When she's finished, she fills a bowl with some pickled cucumbers, with a plate for the omelet, leaving another one out for me. And we chew, hunched over the counter, hip to hip. So, says Mitsuko, how long have you been sleeping with my son? Or is it casual? Not really, I say. I don't know how it works, says Mitsuko. I say, I think it's the same for everyone, and Mitsuko immediately says it isn't. She says, I'm sure you can tell that Michael and I are very close. I say, we've been together for 4 years, more or less. More? Mitsuko asks, or less? A little more, I say. But just a little? She says. Mike's better with numbers, I say. It occurs to me, out of nowhere, that my posture is entirely fucked up. Mitsuko's is impeccable, even at a lean. So I straighten up, and then I stoop, and Mitsuko raises an eyebrow. She snorts and says, my son could not be worse with numbers. After that, we eat in silence. Scattered Spanish filters in through the window, and the kids next door kick a ball against the wall until their father steps outside screaming, asking which one of them has lost their minds. While Mitsuko's focused on her food, I really look at her, And it's clear that at one point, she was a startlingly beautiful woman. Then she meets my eyes, and I blink like something's in them. She says, I realize that this must be strange for you too. No, I say, it's fine. So you're a liar, says Mitsuko. I'm being honest, really. I'm fluent in fine, says Mitsuko. Fine means fucked. Did my son tell you how long he'd be gone? A month? I say, maybe two? I don't know. We didn't talk too much about it. Of course not, says Mitsuko. But, I say, did he tell you? Tell me what, says Mitsuko. How long he'd be gone, I say, or that he was leaving. No, says Mitsuko. My son neglected to give me that information. But this could be a good thing. I needed to get out of the country for a while. No sense in rushing back home to look to dying now. So I ask, you're staying here until Mike gets back? My voice cracks just a bit, but Mitsuko spots it. She grins. Would that be a problem? She asks. No, I say, that's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? I'm sorry, I say. I really was just asking. It's enough for Mitsuko to cross her arms. She leans on the counter and her hair slips down her shoulders. I make a point to slow my breathing to let my shoulders droop just a bit. Then, says Mitsuko, I think staying here is exactly what I'll do. I could use the time off. Your place is fucking filthy, but it'll work until Mike makes it back. And that's absolutely okay, I say. Totally perfect. Remember, says Mitsuko, you're the one who let him leave. You're right, I say. I'm the one who let him leave. How generous, says Mitsuko, but then she doesn't say anything else. Once she's finished her bowl, she drops it in the sink. She turns on the faucet and she reaches for mine. The omelet was delicious, the sort of thing that Mike would cook, because he did everything in the kitchen, and I think that this could have been the problem to begin with. Nice chat, says Mitsuko, and I apologize, but I don't know why. The next morning, for the very first time, Mike's mother knocks on my door. She's fully dressed while I lean on the doorway in a tank top and boxers, and she says, Jesus fucking Christ. Take your time, get ready. I'll be waiting outside. We leave 5 minutes later. Our black neighbors wave from their porch, and there's a question on the grandfather's face as he looks at the two of us, and I wonder if he'll ask it. But Mitsuko doesn't look away from his gaze. If anything, she walks slower, staring him down. Mike's car is filthy with clothes. Our hoodies and socks and a loose pair of shoes. The whole thing smells like him, and I know his mother smells it too. When I toss a pair of shorts behind us, she grunts, and there's a jockstrap in the back seat, and I pray to no god in particular that Mitsuko doesn't catch it. We've pulled out of the neighborhood and into town when Mitsuko says, You're sure this grocery store will have what I need? They should, I say. You and Mike make the same things. Maybe similar, says Mitsuko, not same. We drive through the mix of locals beginning their day. Whole swaths of Houston look like chunks of other countries. There are potholes beside gourmet bakeries, beside taquerias, beside noodle bars, copied and pasted onto a graying landscape. At a stoplight, these two smiling guys walk a toddler across the street, holding the little girl's hands on either side. One of the men is white. The other one's brown. They look like something straight out of Queer Eye. I glance at Mitsuko, and her face doesn't tell me much. So, she says, You're black. You noticed, I say. Just barely, says Mitsuko. And how did you find my son? Accidentally, I say. Let me guess, says Mitsuko. It was Grindr. It wasn't, I say. You found my son on the internet. No, we met at a get-together. An acquaintance introduced us. Sure, says Mitsuko. Once the couple crosses the road, their daughter looks up at them, beaming. She is the happiest that a child has ever been. Ever. If Mike had seen them, he'd feign some sort of choking, or he'd honk his horn, or he'd go sober, not saying very much at all. Our local H Mart is inconceivably closed for the day, and the next grocery store I bring Mitsuko to is objectively filthy, but there's everything that she needs. There's also a metal detector by the entrance. The doorway is flanked by a fried chicken vendor and shrubs. Older women and their children finger carrots on our left, and a little girl wandering the aisles wears a branch of parsley like a crown. I drift around looking for a shopping cart, and I find one with 3 wheels. We end up filling the whole thing, and also the basket, and also the crooks of Mitsuko's elbows. At the register, I feel for my wallet, and I wait for Mitsuko to stop me, but she doesn't. So I pull out my card, slowly, and that's when Mitsuko plucks the bill from her bag, shaking her head. The girl behind the register laughs, tugging at a braid. Just like a man, she says. Isn't it? Says Mitsuko. In the parking lot outside, a pair of women in hijabs are yelling. Everything they say is punctuated with a gasp. Everything is horrible. They're both close to tears, but then they fall on top of each other, laughing until they're breathless. A few weeks later, I text Mike in the evening, thinking he'll just be starting his day after Mitsuko and I finish an elaborate collaboration. Udon cooked in a hot pot beside abunage, kamaboko, and spinach, and 2 chicken legs. When Mitsuko cracks an egg into the pot, tasting a spoonful, she actually doesn't grimace. It's edible, she says. Really? Really. Once we brought everything below a simmer, I take some photos, and all of them are blurry, but when I send them to Mike, he responds immediately. Nice, he says, in all caps, with an exclamation point. Mike has never, not once, used an exclamation point in our correspondence. He's not one of those people. I ask if he's all right, and the next message he sends takes a little longer to arrive. I'll call soon, he says. Everything will be okay, he says. I promise, he says, and that's what I take to sleep with me. But the thing is, Mike's never promised anything. He's only delivered or didn't. He always said that promises were only words, and words only meant what you made them. So, it's late when I hear the front lock jiggling. I slip on basketball shorts, some sandals, and dip into the living room, and that's when I catch Mitsuko sliding into a jacket and her pair of graying sneakers. She gives me a look when I cough in the hallway, and she says, "You can come, but keep your fucking mouth shut." We walk from the apartment to the next street over, and then a few blocks more. The air is mild for Houston, a little too crisp for February, and plodding behind Mitsuko on the sidewalk, I wonder what we look like to anyone peeking from their windows. Eventually, we stop in front of what looks like a church. Something Methodist. I look at Mitsuko, and then at the signage, and she waves me over to the building's entrance, which is unlocked. There's a light on by the pulpit, but otherwise, the altar's empty. The aisles are cleared. The seats are clean. The church's windows are stained with various highlights from the Old Testament. Once we've reached the head of the pulpit, Mitsuko takes to her knees. I feel ridiculous standing behind her, so I settle into the space on her right, and we stay like that for a little while. Mitsuko mutters gently, quietly, in Japanese. Her hands are clasped, and her head is bowed. At one point, I hear Mike's name, and then once again, but that's all I get. It's been at least a decade since I've stepped in a church. I'd been baptized as a teenager because my mother had insisted, and the pastor dunked me in the water and everything, and afterward I came out soaking, feeling brand new, like money, and I ate a wafer, drank some wine, and I never went back again. I wonder how long Mitsuko's been doing this. I wonder if it's even legal, if we're trespassing somehow. But once Mitsuko's finished, she nods toward the choir bleachers at no one at all. Then she stands beside me, steadying herself on my shoulder. Hurry up, she says. We're leaving. Back in the apartment, I pour us both a glass of water. Mitsuko doesn't thank me, but she takes it anyway. In case you're wondering, she says, that's what it's come to. It's absurd. I don't think it's absurd, I say. It's absurd, says Mitsuko. I watch her drink her water. That's all she has to say. So I take my glass to the bedroom, draining the rest on the way. Great.
Thanks, Bryan. It was great. It's nice to
thank you.
Nice to hear that. I can't wait to read that novel. So it's nice to hear you read from it. So hey, yeah, we've got some time for Q&A. So any questions you want to throw Bryan's way, start throwing them. And you can put them in the chat, or you can scream them out loud.
Hey, Alan, I have a question. This is Heather.
Go for it, Heather.
Hi, Bryan. Thank you. That was great. Thanks for being here.
So much.
There are funny moments in there, and I was just thinking about what it must be like to write moments that are potentially funny, and if you have to think about, I mean, I'm not sure exactly how you think about the balance of your writing, but do you want certain things to be funny and then worry that they're not, or do you, in other words, like the component of humor seems like it would be hard to negotiate for any writer. I'm just curious about how you think about those kinds of moments in your work.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's like an interesting problem for me because in many ways, like my friends are my first readers, right? Like I have like a target group of friends that I show my drafts to before anybody else sees them, or I send them to an editor or anything else. And they are very funny. Like I will never be as funny as they are. So I know that if something works for them, then there is a target audience for that particular brand of humor. Like whether it is a wide audience or not is like an entirely different thing. But I think that in a lot of ways, much of what I'm concerned with fiction-wise revolves around this idea of like communication and the many different ways that folks are able to communicate with one another, and whether that's through just talking the more obvious way, or through physical connection, or through something as simple as like texting or sending one another photos or cooking. And humor is always interesting to me because it, on the page at least, like structurally, it feels very much like a way to lessen the emotional hit of a scene without really decreasing the emotional weight of a scene. And so I'm able to have the characters interact with one another in ways that if they were just sort of on their faces, or perhaps more straightforward, talking about their races, their respective races, let's say, or their sexualities or their respective genders, it could read more akin to like a textbook, or could read more akin to a series of things that these characters think or that Bryan thinks. But I think that when it's couched in humor, if it's couched in humor with precision, it can be really amenable to the storyline. And I think that what a character or what a person finds funny is as revealing about what they value, what they don't value, where their flashpoints are, where their points of conflict are, as anything else. Because I think that in order to find a joke funny, really in order to intuit a joke, there's a certain sort of calculus that has to be made between, you know, the joke teller and the person who's receiving that joke. And a shorthand is established almost instantaneously depending on, you know, how it's delivered. And that shorthand is really interesting to me, and the speed of that shorthand is really interesting to me. But what I really like is that it creates a symbiotic relationship between the text and the audience, or the text and the person that's reading it, in that I don't have to tell a reader that something is funny, and in many ways I can't tell a reader that something is funny because that diminishes, if not eliminates, the joke entirely. But if they're able to key into what the unspoken thing is, or what the unsaid thing is, I think that in many ways it adds an additional layer to whatever overarching narrative predicated the joke, which I really like. And I think that if you stack that over the course of a narrative, you end up with a certain amount of emotional weight that you might not have otherwise, or at least on my end, that might be a bit more difficult to acquire through other means. So all of it is to say that I'm always really interested in just the many different forms that a joke can take. And I'm especially interested in humor that surfaces in moments that aren't particularly, I suppose, like forward facing as being funny, right? Like a young cis Black dude with his cis Asian American partner with an elderly Asian mother driving in a car in Houston. And as, you know, the driver, like the Black dude, flips through radio stations to find something that is amenable to all parties, all he comes across is a variation of trap music or hard rap, right? Like that is, there's something funny about that, right? Like the combination of unlike things simultaneously and stacking them on top of one another. But it's a sort of humor that if I were, you know, just explaining it, like it felt deeply unfunny, right? It felt like a textbook of like a scenario that could happen at one point in time. So I'm always really interested in how to wring humor from scenarios where it might not otherwise be found. And if I'm able to extrapolate it from those moments to see what it can reveal over the course of the narrative about the characters that are sharing that exchange.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So if for Dr. Sewell's helping to sort of highlight people, if you raise the hand raising function, it'll be easier to find you. So if you have a question, just raise a hand like that. But we do have a question that's in the chat. This is from the collection lot, and it says, we read A Leaf in Class. My classmates and I were wondering what compelled you to use the first person plural and write from the point of view of the community.
That's a great question. I think that for Lot specifically, what presented itself as being a challenge to me, because I think I'm someone that, in addition to latching on to questions for a text and in lieu of answering that question, taking the question to the terminal end of my particular interest in it, I had to find different ways to challenge myself as far as the form is concerned in order to sustain my interest over the course of a given project. And the communal voice was deeply interesting to me because in many ways, just from the outset, is the fiction within a fiction, because every voice is singular in its own way, it's autonomous in its own way. So accumulating any series of voices, whether it's two people that are allegedly in agreement with one another or an entire community of folks that are allegedly in agreement with one another, that is a fiction in and of itself, because these folks, like individually, autonomously, have their own singular voices. And it felt interesting to me to see if I could take a communal voice and to see if I could split it into many different fragments, so that within that larger communal voice, the individual components could shine through from sentence to sentence, or perhaps from fragment to fragment. And the trick for me, or I suppose like the challenge for me, for Peggy Parkinson specifically, was trying to see how many different fragments of that particular voice, how many different individual people I could flip into that larger communal voice. And once they had entered the communal voice, I wanted to see if each of those characters and each of those voices could be sustained by the guise of like this we, right? I think there's just one thing, like to start a narrative by saying, oh, we think that, grass is green or whatever, and then have 20 different individual voices chime in with other things that they think. So the question of whether that overarching we voice can sustain all of those voices, it's a tricky question, and it's a difficult technical thing, but that sort of thing is interesting to me. So playing with the different ways that we can operate, or our can operate, while simultaneously keeping like the integrity of like an individual voice is a challenge, but it's just like a fascinating structural challenge.
Julia Berserto? Yep.
That's okay. Yeah, so I had a question about when you're creating these characters and you're trying to incorporate this like voice that you just talked about, but you're putting yourself in their mind and you're creating their thoughts and you're just speaking from their thoughts. Do you ever find that you're creating out of your own thoughts do you ever read your writing and you're like, that's me? Or how do you separate yourself in creating a character?
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think and it's something that works for me. It works with some other folks in my cohort. It might not work for you, but it also might, just the simple trick of reading aloud. Yeah, I mean, I think that is, if there were like 3 or 4 things that have been the most immediately functional as far as like my writing process is concerned, that would be up there on that particular list, because I think that with a bit of separation. Just the act of, say, like recording yourself, like reading a particular passage or recording yourself reading a particular exchange. You get a sense, or at least I get a sense of various intonations. I get a sense of starts and stops. I get a sense of sentence structures and when they vary and when they don't vary. And having an ear for that is something that often, I'm not very good at. So I need the double layer of editing afterwards, seeing it visually and also hearing it. And that has been really helpful for me, so that I have a better understanding of maybe this particular character speaks largely through silence, right? Like that much of the emotional weight of what they're trying to get across is what they don't say. Whereas another character, they just pontificate and pontificate and pontificate, and the words just like way down the page, but it's when they're coming up short for what they want to say that what they really mean shines through, right? Like that's the sort of thing that doesn't really reveal itself to me immediately, but through quite a lot of drafting and quite a lot of studying and just like reading a lot of other folks and just turning back to my own work as far as why does this person speak this particular way or not. That's really helped as far as getting a sense of how different people talk, and also playing with the form. I think that for the memorial, like the novel that I was just sort of reading from, there are two speakers. One of the speakers is very circumspect in that they'll speak in choppy sentences. Sometimes their chapters are one line for the entirety of the page. Sometimes they're a handful of graphs. And the other speaker pontificates and pontificates and pontificates. And I think that playing with the sentence structures there was important to me to also show how they changed over the course of time, so that that former speaker, as the novel progresses, they speak more and they're more active, and their sentence structures are more dynamic as a result of that, whereas the latter speaker grows more and more circumspect and they speak less and less and less. It's the sort of thing that, like, if you say it and you make it obvious, the weight is diminished. But you can play with sentence structures and you can do all sorts of things that can be deeply unstated while still adding emotional weight to the dialogue and the different ways that folks communicate with each other. So just like reading a lot, just editing a lot, I mean, it gets significantly easier the more that you do it.
Thanks, Juliet. Olivia Stowell.
Hi, thank you so much. Your reading was amazing. It was great to get to hear parts of the novel. I've read it and I love it, and so it was really great to get to hear you read it. And I guess my question would be, and I think that this is maybe true of the novel as a whole, but also in the section that you read today, that there's so many of these great evocative specific food moments, I think, in both of the kind of narrators' stories in different ways. And I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about how you see kind of food working in the novel as a whole, and what it means to both of the characters, and sort of the other secondary characters circling around them, and what sort of food is doing for you in the book. That's
a great question. Yeah, thank you for asking. I think that there's a food writer, a queer food writer named John Birdsall, who is a friend, and he read a very early copy of the novel, and he got it the secret reading of it, which is that it's secretly about two young men who learn how to cook for one another, or learn how to love one another through cooking for one another. And food in Memorial, and I think I'm finding more generally in my work, operates just as another way of communication, in the same way that humor does, in the same way that texting or whatever photos characters are sending one another does. In that, for Memorial specifically, there are 3 different food trajectories, right? And that was interesting to me, the trajectory of a character who was not aware that they could utilize a culinary language in order to express their feelings, and has an arc of just learning that language, right? Like a character for whom scrambled eggs is just witchcraft at the beginning of the novel, ends up finding himself in a position where he can actually cook a fairly serviceable meal. That's a certain arc. And then there's another arc in which a character whose culinary language is perhaps a bit more established has to learn not to force what he thinks or what he wants onto the characters around him, right? So in lieu of forcing his iterations of a meal onto them, taking the time to ask what they actually need and how they would like to be nourished. And I think that what is sort of overlying over that is another character, Mitsuko, whose culinary language is deeply deliberate and deeply vast, but who utilizes it as a way of comfort and as a way of establishing solace, right? Like, she is a woman who arrives in a country that she's not been in quite a long time to visit her son, and her son immediately tells her, like, actually, I'm leaving and you're staying with my maybe partner. I think that there are many different ways that someone could react to that. But the first thing that Mitsuko does is cook herself and this maybe partner a meal, like from the outset, creating a position of comfort, creating a position of solace. So whatever quips that she might throw at him and whatever jabs that she might throw at him and whatever critiques that she might throw at him, they can really only responsibly be viewed from behind this veil of comfort that she has immediately established and continues to establish over the course of the book. It's a different way, I think, the cooking for one another that these characters have of establishing honesty with one another. And some of these characters perhaps aren't very used to that sort of verbal honesty or that emotional honesty. And it's another way of them trying to express that, right? I'm always interested in the hoops that a character will jump through, not to say what they're actually thinking or what they're actually feeling. And food feels like one way in which I can get a bit closer to closing that distance for characters across a particular text, whether it's Memorial or any other fictional project that I happen to be working through.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating and wonderful, and I appreciate it so much.
Thank you for your question.
Questions out there? Right. I guess I have one, Bryan. Obviously you sort of broke out with short stories, and Lot is just an amazing collection of stories. It's just really wonderful, I think. And I'm wondering about like the transition to writing a novel. Like, what was that process like? How different was it? Was it a difficult thing to do? Did you have to approach the writing a lot differently? How was your process different than focusing on shorts? Obviously, short story is short and novel's long, but how was that transition, and what did you do? How'd your process change?
Yeah, I think that if I could try and like break the answer I give into two parts, I think that when I'm approaching fiction, it's usually from the position of working toward or around a question, and I'm not really generally or specifically interested in answering that question one way or another so much as furthering my understanding of what that question is or what that question could yield, and perhaps creating more questions. And the length that I'm able to work through that question often dictates what the length of a particular project will be. So if I'm only able to sustain interest in that particular question for the course of 1,500 words, and it's quite a short story, or if I'm able to extend it perhaps to 6,000 words, 7,000 words, or the 4,000 word zone seems to be like the New Yorker pocket. So if I hit it around 4,000 words, and that's the length of that particular question. But there are some questions like those for Memorial, this idea of what is a home, or can a home change, or can you make a home out of a person, or what is a family, or what are your obligations to family that is not blood, and what are your obligations to family that is blood, and what happens when they supersede one another or they intertwine and a helix is created and you really don't know where your actual obligations lie. That and those questions don't really have answers, or insofar as you're able to have a conversation about them, they're dynamic conversations that change from context to context. And it felt like those questions could sustain the length of, like a 75,000 word project. It felt as if though, actually Memorial was actually like a short story. Originally it was, I wrote it for free for like a friend's zine, and it was like less than like 1,100 words. And I was in the middle of writing another project at the time, like a novel. I talked a little bit about it, like this novel that no one will ever see because like it's fucking sucks, it's boring. And the questions that I thought that I was interested in for that particular project were questions that were not interesting to me, but they were questions that I thought that like a publisher would find interesting. And that revealed itself in the process and also in the writing itself. But so I kept turning back to these questions that were interesting to me, and I would bug my friends about them, and I would bug my agent about them. And then eventually they sort of Voltron formed a group and said, maybe you should work on the thing that you are actually interested in. And it took a little while for me to come around to that way of thinking. But once I have a sense of something being a question that I could follow for quite a long time, I'm able to come up with an actual structure of what about that particular thing am I most interested in, and how can I play with it as far as narrative is concerned. Like, how can I really exacerbate what within that question, the sort of creases within it that feel less definable through interactions between characters.
Thank you.
Yeah,
we all have that stucky novel that nobody will ever see. You'll never see the light of day somewhere. Mine's
oh yeah, it's ghastly. Yeah, no one will ever see it.
I think there was a question from Jill.
Yeah, I have a question. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
So you touched on this a little bit about point of view, but I had to tell you, I was reading to my youngest, and we were reading a story in first person, and he was saying, "Wait, who is this talking? And who is he talking to?" And I thought, that's such a great, that's the question, right? And so I was just thinking, as I said, you already touched on this a little bit when you were talking about your collection of short stories, but could you tell us a little bit about how you decide about point of view, and, who are you talking to in your novel, or just in general?
Oh, that's a good question. I have the not thoughtful answer to that particular question, but the one that's perhaps the most true is that the third person is extremely difficult to me, and I just say writing is hard enough. I gravitate away from things that are difficult to do on that particular part. So unless I absolutely think that I cannot accomplish something without drifting into the third person, I will not utilize it, and that's usually that I go out of my way not to use the third person, right? Like I'll use a communal voice to avoid not using the third person, which is, structurally more difficult, but like it makes more sense. It's less, the third person is like so much authority for me. I can't wrap my hands around it. But I have friends who, they look at me like, oh, how is that easier than trying to inhabit like the interiority of a person? And I just can't explain it. But perhaps a more thoughtful answer is that I write for an audience of my friends, right? Like I write for, folks that are dear to me, and I also write for an audience of myself. And that it's a bit gauche to say, I suppose, but like writing the sort of book that you want to read is like really important to me. For Lot specifically, the contemporary American literary publishing is not over inundated with narrative collections that are centered on Houston. So I thought it would be interesting to, try and write something like that. And as far as Memorial is concerned, like our industry is similarly not overburdened on the bookshelves by the weight of, queer rom-coms that are international and working with food and a number of other things. And I thought that would be something that I would be interested in reading. It just seems like a fascinating thing if someone could pull that off. And I was just really lucky to be able to get to work with folks who thought that I might be able to do that. So I think that when I have a character, I think as far as their voice and as far as like who they're speaking to is concerned, the foremost thing for me is less who they're speaking to than what they're not doing. And it's important to me that they not make concessions as far as understandability is concerned, and that they are speaking in a community amongst themselves, and that it's an intercommunal conversation, which feels especially significant for me because virtually all of my characters are from marginalized backgrounds. And it's important to me that these characters are in communication and in conversation with one another, as opposed to like a refraction of like white supremacy or like a refraction of like heteronormativity. And that's really important to me. And I think that the sort of implied risk that I really don't think is a risk is that you lose understandability from like wider audiences. But like I think for my experience, like in my specific experience, I mean, readers are okay with doing the work if there's a story there that they can be invested in, and every reference, every mode of dialogue, every switch from context to context or code to code doesn't have to be immediately decipherable for a reader to get invested in or to feel as if though they have agency within a story. If there is a story there, that they can have agency. And so it's really important to me that these characters are in conversations with folks who are like them and folks who are within their communities, whether it's the community specifically that a character belongs to or the communities that are parallel or adjacent to them.
Okay. Thank you.
All right,
Thank
Lisa
you.
has got her hand up.
I've got my hand up. Here, let me take my hand down. Wait, okay. So I just was wondering if you could talk about like people who were really important to you in terms of figuring out how to write those stories that you wanted to write about, you know, that you felt there was a need for. And just to talk about, because I'm so curious to know who is influencing you and who's important to you as a sort of model for approaching your work.
That's a great question. I mean, I think I've been really fortunate to get to work in Mo's and around environs and around folks who have been just open and thoughtful as far as what I'm trying to do is concerned. I mean, I did undergrad at the University of Houston. There was an instructor there who's now at the University of Oregon, Matt Johnson, who was deeply supportive and deeply thoughtful from the outset. And he did a thing that not very many people do, which is that he gave the time and he treated his students like colleagues, which is just not something that I had been exposed to very often or at all in that particular juncture, and certainly not as far as fiction was concerned. Like, it just wasn't something that had been on my particular horizon. I mean, when I was at the University of Houston, I was lucky to get to intern and work for a little while at the lit journal Gulf Coast. Dr. Perry worked there for a while. A guy named Carlos Hernandez there also worked there, and two more folks that were deeply thoughtful, right, and gave people the time and took their ideas as far as fiction, as far as idea, as far as narrative seriously, which, you know, again, this is a thing that is rare or has been rare in my experience. So you know, working with those folks in Houston, working with Joanna Leake at the University of New Orleans, folks who have just been really amenable to narratives that are not front-facing is profitable, or perhaps front-facing is being directly what the market might reward, has been a really big boon. And also finding, you know, later on a cohort of writers that were also working in the same sphere, whether it's folks like Nafisa Thompson-Spears, whether it's folks like Ocean Vuong, whether it's a number of people who are telling stories about their communities and doing it in such a way where they are not making concessions as far as definability, or really even as far as a more mass readership is concerned, like really writing for themselves and also writing for their friends and insisting on having that inter-community conversation and forcing, but also allowing readers to have that conversation with them, right? Allowing them into that particular space. I mean, I think that there's a way in which, I mean, at least my particular revolutions around American literary fiction, where the question of what a voice is, or like what a story is trying to do, can be posed as a way of, okay, I can't access this particular narrative because I don't get the vernacular, or because it's about communities that aren't mine, or it's about, you know, people or a place or a time that is divorced from my experience, as though it's, you know, some sort of barrier, when, you know, at least from my standpoint and from the standpoint of folks I've been lucky enough to get to work with, the question is more of like, we're being allowed to spend time with these folks that have these experiences and that are from these communities that have otherwise perhaps not gotten to have their stories have that sort of visibility, right? Like, I'm reticent to say that they're not being told, because they're being told every day, but perhaps they're not given the sort of visibility that they are getting now. You know, I mean, it feels like a big gift in that regard. So getting to write in, the particular cohort that I'm writing with now has only really been possible because of other folks who have done what they can to write about their communities and have those inter-community conversations, and also the folks who spoke have been really thoughtful and supportive of me and given me the time. So I try to think of them in the midst of my trying to write the structurally difficult and deeply unmarketable narratives that I find really dear.
Well, thank you for that answer and for your work, which is really a gift. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
I think we have maybe time for one more question. If you've got one you want to throw out there that you've just been dying to ask. Well,
I'd like to ask a question. This is AGP. Bryan, it's just so great to see you, by the way. And and I'm really grateful that you wrote this collection about Houston, which was a town I came to love by living there for 5 years. And I feel like it has so much to teach people about what you were just talking about, community. But one of the things you said earlier, I feel like you mentioned this in class and you talked about it this evening, is writing the story that you want to see in the world, but also having this awareness of, a readership or the sort of, is this a marketable story? And one of the things I've wondered about right now is that I think there are stories that people want to write, but then I think there are sometimes stories that they feel like they should be writing because of what's happening in the world, particular conversations that they're becoming aware of. And I kind of wonder how you see responding to the pull of what we feel sort of called to write about versus what we might feel like, what is my responsibility as a writer, as an artist right now to speak to? I see you nodding your head, and so I almost feel like would say save me from myself. I'll just wrap up this question.
No.
Yeah. Because I think sometimes you want to write about something that doesn't have anything to do with the now, and so, but feel also torn because then it feels like you're tapping out on being a responsible artist. So anyway, I'd love to hear what you think.
That's like a group chat question. That's a very good question. I think that, and my case has been deeply specific because I think that I've been really fortunate to work with teams and to work with people who are committed to telling, and in that telling, on the back end to marketing the things that I am trying to do for and within the boundaries of the stories themselves, in lieu of the market, in lieu of world events. And that feels like a gift in a lot of ways. My publicist is a Black woman, my publicist assistant is a Black woman. And there are many ways that the marketing for a memorial and by way of that, by lot, could have been absolute car crashes, right? It could have just been absolutely ghastly. And much of those processes were all of us hopping on a Zoom or being in a room and talking through, okay, what are we actually trying to achieve? What we want to actually put out into the world. And that's maybe in an especially exaggerated specific case, the idea of marketing a book in relation to your question. But for me, I think how I've navigated that is that and we talked about it a bit in class, but I really only try and write about things if I am invested in that particular project, irrespective of the virality that I think a piece might acquire, irrespective of what an outlet might think is most SEO optimizable, what they think might get the most clicks, what they think might get the most readership, and so on. So I wrote about the uprisings over the summer, right? Because I wanted to do that, right? I felt compelled to do that. I wanted to write about how they looked in Houston. I wanted to write about Floyd's funeral as it was experienced in Houston, because it was pretty apparent to me that there were not very many people in Houston who had access and privilege to have access to the outlets that I had access to, who could write about those events and those very particular experiences of those events in that way. And it felt important to me to do that. And I think that the question on that end becomes, okay, well, let's say those particular pieces get a lot of readership and they go super viral. Do I pivot to solely making that my beat? The answer for me isn't really no, but it isn't yes either. It just depends on whether I want to do that, whether I think that I can do that in some ways. I mean, I think that I get asked to write a lot about, like capital R race, like in the States, but I get asked to write a lot about like capital R race in publishing. And I think that for every, like 9 or 10 asks that I get, 8 or 9 of them, I will pivot to someone else. I will say like, hey, like I am not the person to do that. Like maybe you should ask a Black woman instead, or maybe you should ask some other marginalized entity to have these conversations. Because oftentimes if I write a particular piece, I try to do everything that I'm trying to do in that piece, and then I might not have anything else to say on that particular front, right? So I think that figuring out like what my particular values are as far as like publishing is concerned, as far as what I want to make visible is concerned, as far as how I approach needing breathing room to think about something, because it's also a conflicting factor in that an event occurs and then there's a race for X number of outlets and Y number of editors to find someone to respond to it within 24 hours. But let's say you need 25 hours to think about it, right? Let's say you need 4, 5, 6 months to think about that particular thing. So really being didactic and really trying to be as precise as possible about what I actually think I should be saying and what I should and can allow my voice to, or what I can and should say, hey, maybe this other person can do that, or like, hey, maybe you should actually talk to a mutual aid organizer instead, right? So that you have actionable things that you can do with this information. So really trying to be thoughtful about what I respond to and when I respond to it, while understanding that just because you can't come up with, a 1,500 word essay within, 24 hours doesn't mean that you're not thinking about that thing. Maybe you were in the midst of writing an essay or a story about cats, right? And that was like the thing that you were doing, right? Many things can be true simultaneously. An overlong, like sort of circuitous answer to like a really great question. It's something that's, it's something that I think about all the time. I mean, it's something that I imagine will only grow more and more prescient.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Bryan.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, well, Bryan, that was great. Thank you so much. Thank you for all the time you've given us and thoughtful answers you provided, and the wonderful reading was really fantastic, and it was great to meet you. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Hope to see you April 8th and April 15th for the other 2 events of the season. And you give it up for Bryan again. And thank you so much.